Hey Chevra, what's going on? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Ayin Daled, Daf 74 of Masechta Ayruvin. Today's cool. Why not? So, talking about permitting a mavui with a lechi and a korah, right? So there's like two things that come up when it comes to mavui, right? One is, as we know from the beginning of Masechta Ayruvin, putting up a lechi or a korah, but you also have to do shitufei mavos if there are multiple chatzers. But, if there aren't multiple chatzers, well, that's what we're going to talk about today. And then we're going to discuss Rabbi Shimon's opinion that came up already in Masechta Shabbos about being able to carry from Rosh Hashanah, right, from a chatzer to a gag to a karpaf, that whole exciting sugya. And then talk about an interesting configuration between a mavui and two chatzers and townhouses and all sorts of interesting architectural designs. So that's today's daf. It's not a particularly long daf, so let's do it, Chevre. So we're going to start on daf Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. Gufa, we said earlier, Amar Rav, in Mavu nitar belechi v'kora, ad shu batam achzeres psuchim nesocho. Okay, so Rav says that in order for you to be able to put up a lechi or a korah and be able to carry in a mavui, once you have done that, well, you need to have at least 2 chatzers in the mavui and at least 2 houses that open into each of the chatzers. Okay, so Shmuel Amar, and Shmuel says, Afilu bayis echad v'chatzer achas. Shmuel says actually all you need is 1 chatzer in the mavui and then just 1 house. So you don't necessarily need and in that chatzer even all you need is 1 house. So according to Rav, you need 2 chatzers. In each of the 2 chatzers there have to be 2 houses. According to Shmuel, you need 1 chatzer. In that 1 chatzer is just 1 house, and then you just need 1 other house. So really just 1 chatzer and a house. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan takes Shmuel even a step further and says all you need is 1 chatzer, and in that chatzer all you need is 1 house, and then on the other side, or connected to this mavui in some other way, you just need a chorva, some kind of dilapidated ruin. Well, there you have it. That's the machlokas. Amle Abai Rav Yosef. So Abai says to his Rebbe Rav Yosef, Rabbi Yochanan afilu b'shvil shel kramim. Would Rabbi Yochanan say even if you have a chatzer on one side with, let's say, with 1 house in it, and then on the other side is a path through vineyards, but like no living space or anything like that. So Amrle, so Rav Yosef says to Abai, Rabbi Yochanan, Lo Amar Rabbi Yochanan ela b'churva dechazi ledira. Look, Rabbi Yochanan says that you can have 1 chatzer and 1 churva because you can at least live in a dilapidated ruin. Aval shvil shel kramim to lechazi ledira lo. But a path through vineyards that is not fit for living in, that wouldn't work for the mavui, and you wouldn't be able to just put up a lechi and a korah and call it a day. Sorry. But okay, but the ruin can work according to Rabbi Yochanan. Let's go weiter, Chevre. Amar Avuna bar Chinana. Says Avuna bar Chinana v'azda Rabbi Yochanan l'taime. And Rabbi Yochanan, by saying that if you have 1 chatzer and 1 ruin that open up into this mavui, you can put up a lechi or korah and call it a day, and you can carry in the mavui, that is consistent with Rabbi Yochanan's opinion elsewhere. Where is that? The Tanan, as we learn in the Mishnah, Amar Reb Shimon. Says Reb Shimon, Echad Gagos. Where is this Mishnah? I think maybe it's coming up later on. So Reb Shimon, Echad Gagos, Vechad Karpefos, Vechad Chatzeres, that between roofs and karpafs and chatzers, right, karpafs of course being some non-residential space that is 70 2/3 amos by 70 2/3 amos or less. Rishus achas in the kelim sheshav su l'sochan. So they are all considered 1 rishus for the vessels, the items that were in them when Shabbos began, v'lo l'chelim sheshav su b'soch habayis, but not to the kelim that were in the house when Shabbos began. Meaning, so if you have a chatzar, okay, let's say you have 2 chatzars right next to each other, right? 1 chatzar, then next door to it is another chatzar. Fine. So what Reb Shimon is saying is that if when Shabbos began, there was a basketball in one of the chutzers, not in a house, just lying out in the chutzar. So you would be able to transport that basketball transfer that basketball from one chutzar to the other chutzar, no big deal. One Rosh Hashanah to another Rosh Hashanah, that's no problem. Even though they're owned by two different owners and there's no Eruv, it's okay. But if the basketball was in a house when Shabbos began, well then you won't be able to transfer it to a different chutzar, and if there's no Eruv, you won't even be able to transfer it from the house into your own chutzar. Now, Rav, and Rav says halacha Reb Shimon. So Rav says that the halacha is like Reb Shimon, vehu shelo ervu. But that's only if, says Rav, the chutzar in which the basketball is in did not do an eruvei chatzeris, aval ervu. But if they did do an eruvei chatzeris, kazrinan dilma asila fuke mane devatim the chutzar, we're concerned that, well, maybe somebody from the house, maybe that basketball when Shabbos began was not in the chutzar, maybe it was in the house, and then somebody brought it out to the chutzar from the house because they didn't eruvei chatzeris, so that's perfectly okay. But what's not okay is that since the basketball was in the house when Shabbos began, you can no longer carry it into another chutzar, right? So Reb Shimon says you'd be allowed to carry this basketball from one chutzar to another chutzar if it was in the chutzar when Shabbos began. But if it was in a house when Shabbos began, you would be unable to transfer from one chutzar to another chutzar. And Rav is saying that because of that detail, that if it was in the house, you would not be able to transfer it from one chutzar to another. Therefore, Rav says that if in the chutzar that the basketball is in, they made an eruvei chatzeros, which would allow you to carry that take that basketball from your house into your chutzar, well, then we have to be concerned that maybe the basketball was in the house when Shabbos began. But if there was no eruvei chatzeros in that chutzar, well then if the basketball's in the chutzar now, then it must have been there when Shabbos began, and you'll be able to transfer it to another chutzar. Ushmuel Amr, says Shmuel, ben ervu uven lo ervu. Shmuel says, meh, even if they made an eruvei chatzeros, we're not concerned that you're going to carry from the house into another chutzar. Okay? V'chein Amr Rabbi Yochanan halacha Reb Shimon, ben ervu uven lo ervu. Rabbi Yochanan says the same thing as Shmuel, which is that the halacha is like Reb Shimon, whether or not they made an eruv, meaning even if they made an eruv, Rabbi Yochanan would still say that the halacha is like Reb Shimon, and you can carry things that were in the chutzar when Shabbos began into another chutzar. We're not concerned that you're going to carry from the house into another chutzar. So almo, so what do we see? That lo gazrinan dilma asila afuke mani debatim lechutzar. So we see that according to Rabbi Yochanan, he's not concerned that you're going to take something from the house and bring it into another chutzar. So hachanami, here also lo gazrinan dilma asila afuke mani dechutzar lechurva. Here also Rabbi Yochanan is being consistent and saying that we're not concerned that this person who lives in the chutzar is going to carry from his chutzar through the mavui into the ruin. That is not a concern of Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore he says that if you have this mavui with one chutzar and one ruin, you would be allowed to put up a lechi or a korah and carry in the mavui. Yosef of Brona, v'kamila shmaita. So Rav Brona was sitting and saying over this sugya, okay, and he was saying that according to Shmuel, all you need is one chutzar and one house in order to permit a mavui. Okay? Amalei Rabbi Elazar. Very interesting stuff over here, just in terms of our characters. So now Rabbi Elazar said to Rav Brona, Bar Beirav, yeshiva student, Amar Shmuel Hachi. Did Shmuel really say this? What's interesting is because I think Rav Brona often quotes Rav, and here we see him in the context of Shmuel, which is perfectly okay, but it's interesting, Rav and Shmuel were kind of the same generation, so I guess perhaps Rav Brona was a student of both. Also, Rabbi Elazar is this interesting character, because if I'm assuming that this is Rabbi Elazar ben Pedas, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that this is Rabbi Elazar ben Pedas. Rabbi Elazar ben Pedas is generally, like, I associate with him with being in Eretz Yisrael with Rabbi Yochanan. Yet we've seen a number of times recently that he was a student of Shmuel and Rav. So it's not so crazy. It could be. It's all the same generation. Rabbi Yochanan, Shmuel, Rav. They're all kind of similar generations, but just Eretz Yisrael and Bavel. Maybe Rabbi Elazar kind of spent some time in both. I don't know. Anyways, so again. So Yosef of Brona v'kamila shmeiter. So Reb Broner was saying this shmeiter. So Amalei Rabbi Elazar. So Rav Brona was saying this thing, right? That Shmuel says that a mavui that has one chatzar and one house, you'd be allowed to just put up a lechi and korah and carry there. Now, says Rabbi Elazar to Rav Brona, Bar Rav, yeshiva student, Amar Shmuel Hachi, did Shmuel really say this? Amalei in. And Rav Brona said, yeah, he did. Amalei. So Rabbi Elazar says to Rav Brona, Ach ve'li ushpize, show me where Shmuel lives. Ach ve'li. So Rav Brona showed him where Shmuel lives. Also the comment to Shmuel. So Rabbi Elazar came to Shmuel. Amalei. And he said to him, Amar Mar Hachi. And he said to Shmuel, he said, did you really say this? Amalei in. He said, yeah, I did. V'hamaru da Amar, to which Rabbi Elazar says to Shmuel, but aren't you the one who said it? And we also saw Rabbi Yosef quote this as well. Where do we see Rabbi Yosef quote this? On Daf Samach Vav. Ein lanu be'Ayruvin ela kuloshin mishnasenu. That Shmuel said that when it comes to Ayruvin, in terms of being able to apply different kulas, we can only apply the ones that are in our Mishnah. Okay? That a mavui is like, or at least in the other context it was about kulas. I don't know, maybe this isn't about kulas. Okay? So, anyways, Ein lanu be'Ayruvin ela kuloshin mishnasenu, that Shmuel says that when it comes to Ayruvin, we only have like that which our Mishnah say. Okay, and what does it say in the Mishnah? That a mavui is for chatzeris, like a chatzer is for houses. Now, the interesting thing there is that it says chatzeros, plural, when it comes to mavui, i.e., that you would have to have at least two chatzeros that open up into the mavui. So how could it be that on the one hand, Shmuel is saying this, that when it comes to Ayruvin, we have to follow the Mishnayos, and it says in the Mishnayos that you have to have two chatzers that open up into a mavui, and yet Shmuel could say such a thing, like when you have a mavui with one chatzer and one house, all you have to do is put up a lechi or a korah, and that would suffice. So ishtik, Shmuel was silent. He didn't have an answer for Rabbi Elazar. Kibla mine or lo kibla mine. So the Gemara wants to know, okay, it was very nice that Shmuel was quiet. Makes for a nice story. A little bit of drama. However, did Shmuel in practice actually accept what Rabbi Elazar was suggesting or not? Did Shmuel take it back? Did Shmuel from then on say that when you have a mavui, you must have two chatzeros? So Tashma, come in here. Dahu mavo tavadayir be ivus bar ihi. Okay, there was a certain mavui, and in this mavui lived a certain ivus bar ihi. Now, he lived in one chatzar in this mavui, mistama with somebody else. Okay, so there was one chatzar, and there were two houses in there. One of them belongs to ivus bar ihi. Now, the assumption, at least for now, seems to be, it's like the facts kind of change throughout the story a little bit, but on the other side of this mavui was a synagogue. And this synagogue had like one kind of living space in it, and it opened up directly into the mavui. Okay, so basically you have one chatzar and one mavui, and one bias essentially, which in this case is a synagogue. Okay. Now avad le lechia. Now Ivus bar Ihi made a lechi in this mavui that has one chatzar and one house. V'shar le Shmuel, and Shmuel was like, yeah, it's cool. Okay, fine. So Shmuel is saying that it's okay to have just simply one chatzar and one house. Also Rav Anan came, Shadye, and he dismantled Ihi bar Ivis's lechi that he put up in his mavui. Omar, and now I'm going to read this. There's an amendment or emendation, I don't know, to this text, and that goes with Tzionim, and it makes it read very nicely. So I'm going to read it with that for the next line or so. So Ihi, after Rav Anan dismantled his lechi, so Ivus bar Ihi said, so Mavoa, this mavui, Tavadairana Bey, Mishnei Demar Shmuel, that I lived in this mavui from the days of Shmuel, Ve'ada Idna, and until now, Nesi Rav Anan, V'leshadya Minoi, Rav Anan's going to come and dismantle it and ruin it for me, right? So meaning, Ivus bar Ihi is basically saying that Shmuel said that this mavui was acceptable. This mavui that has one chatzar and one house was acceptable, and it was all the days of Shmuel, i.e. Shmuel never retracted it. So the question is, right, so Ivus bar Ihi is saying to Rav Anan, how come you're dismantling it if Shmuel seemed to have no problem with it? So, third line of the Gemara. So Shma Mina, so we see from there, Lo Kibla Mine, So we see that clearly Shmuel did not accept Rabbi Elazar's suggestion, right? So Rabbi Elazar was saying, Shmuel, how can you say that one chutzner and one house opening up into a mavui, you could just put up a lechi or kor and call it a day, and then you can carry in the mavui. But after all, Shmuel, didn't you say that, it goes based on the Mishnah, and the Mishnah says multiple chatzeres, you'd have to have at least 2 chutzers. So Shmuel was quiet, and we don't know, did he accept Rabbi Elazar's suggestion or not. So we seem to see from the story of Ivus bar Ihi that he did not accept Rabbi Elazar's suggestion, because apparently Ivus bar Ihi, the entire days of Shmuel, had this configuration with one chotzer and one house with a lechi, and apparently Shmuel was always okay with that. So the Gemara answers no. We're getting a little bit of the facts of this architecture wrong. The Olam Emelach, really, I'll say to you, kibla mine, that really Shmuel did accept Rabbi Elazar's suggestion, and therefore Shmuel's opinion became that in order to be able to carry in a mavui by putting up a lechi and a korah, you have to have at least 2 chutzers opening up into the mavui. V'hacha, but what was exactly the setup of this mavui? Chazanahu dahava achel naima beveise v'asi bayis bevei kinishta. So here, it was actually a little bit different. It was a situation where there was the one chutzner where Ivus bar Ihi lived with somebody else. Now, it wasn't just the synagogue that opened directly into the mavui, in which case it would just be considered like a bias opening up into a mavui. Actually, it was a chutzner, and the synagogue was in a chutzner, and attached to the synagogue was a living space, and in addition to that one living space, there was an additional living space where the chazan, the person who worked in the synagogue, would sleep. Okay? So the facts of this case just totally changed. So now all of a sudden, it actually is a situation of 2 chutzers that open up into a mavui. Okay, now it goes on a little bit. Okay, so again, so v'hacha over here, chazanu hu dava achu nama bevese, that there was this chazan who worked in the shul, who he would eat bread in his house that was somewhere else, v'asi bayis bevei kinishta, but then he would come back to this chutzer where the synagogue is, and he would sleep in one of the houses that were there. The Ivus bar Ihi savar, now Ivus bar Ihi figured Makom Pita Garim. He thought that what's important is where a person eats, and therefore this chazan was eating somewhere else. So from his view, there was this chutzner with the synagogue really only had one person living there, because the chazan isn't considered to be living there even though he sleeps there, since he's eating somewhere else. But of course we know that Shmuel says that what's important is not where you eat, but rather where you sleep. And therefore, as far as Shmuel was concerned, the way he was viewing the situation was, well, there's a mavui. You have the one chutzner that Ihi and somebody else live in. You have this other chutzner that has the synagogue that has some kind of living space for somebody, and this other house where this chazan lives. And since the chazan sleeps in his house, so it's considered like he's living there. And therefore, as far as Shmuel was concerned, this was a mavui with 2 chutzers and 2 houses in each of the chutzers. This is completely acceptable and in line with what Rabbi Elazar was suggesting, based on the Mishnah that says that a mavui has chatzeris in it. So actually, what was going on in this case was that he was a mavui with 2 chutzers, which is why Shmuel allowed it. And Ihi bar Ivus, or Ivus bar Ihi, he made a mistake. He thought that it was only considered that the chutzner with the synagogue only really had one living space in it, because the chazan would eat somewhere else. Okay, very exciting stuff. Okay, Chav, you ready for this? Now we get to this interesting configuration. You ready for an interesting configuration? Okay. So imagine Main Street. And Main Street goes west to east. Okay, so you're walking down Main Street from west to east. Now, off of Main Street, there's a mavui, an alleyway, and that runs north-south. So you're walking down Main Street, west to east, and then you turn north into this mavui, into this alleyway. So far, so good. Now, on your left in the alleyway is a chutzner, and on your right is a chutzner. Great. In the chutzner on your left is a non-Jewish person lives there. Okay, there's one house and there's a non-Jewish person who lives in that house. Fine. Now, in the chutzner on the right, there's one house, and there's a Jewish person that lives in that house. Great. Now, here's the thing. Attached to the chutzner on the right, where the Jew lives, that chutzner is actually, that house is really one of 3 connected townhouses. Okay? Now, it is the first of the 3 townhouses. And to get into this first townhouse, you must turn from Main Street into the mavui, go into the chutzner on the right. That is how you will get into this house. However, the other 2 townhouses that are connected, that are attached, you would enter into them from Rosh Hashanah. So if you're walking down Main Street from west to east, and rather than turning north into the mavui, you would continue walking down Main Street, and on your left there would be 2 doors, right? One for each of the 2 connected townhouses. Okay, so in order to get into the first townhouse, so you would have to turn into the mavui, go into the chutzner on the right, and you would enter into the first townhouse. To get into the next 2 townhouses, you wouldn't go into the mavui, you would continue walking on Main Street, and there would be 2 doors going directly into their houses, okay? And all 3 townhouses are owned by Jews. That is the case that we're talking about. So, Amar Rav Yehuda, says Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, in the name of Rav, mavui, shetzido echad oved kochavim. So if you have the mavui, right, so you're walking down Main Street, west to east, you turn north into the alleyway, and on the left, there is a chutzner that has an oved kochavim that lives there. Vitzido echad Yisrael. And on the other side of the mavui, there is a chutzner that has a Jewish house in it. Ein ma'arvin also derech chalonos la'atir derech psachim lemavui. So we do not allow for these 3 townhouses to make an Eruv together by way of their windows, right? Between each of the 3 townhouses, there was a window that theoretically, well, you could, pass things through and stuff. And I guess if it's 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim, it would be considered enough of a Pesach that you would be able to join together in an Eruv. So we're saying that ein ma'arvin also derech chalonos la'atiro derech psachim lemavui. You may not do this. You may not allow these 3 townhouses to make an Eruv so that they could pass food through the windows into the townhouse that's in the chutzner, so that by way of that townhouse, you can then carry things into the mavui. That's not going to work. Got it? Good. Amar le'Abai le'Rav Yosef. Amar Rav afilu b'chutzner. So now Abai says to Rav Yosef, does this apply also to a chutzner? So what if, instead of the non-Jew being in a separate chutzner, what if it was a mavui that has 1 chutzner in it, and in that chutzner there is, or forget about the mavui b'chlal, you have a chutzner, and in the chutzner live a non-Jewish person and a Jewish person. Now, the house of the Jewish person has the same configuration. It's one of 3 townhouses, but it's the only one that's in the chutzner. So you essentially have a chutzner that has a Jew and a non-Jew living in the chutzner, and then there are 2 townhouses connected to the Jewish house, but they're both outside of the chutzner and Rosh Hashanah, right? To get into them, you'd have to go through Rosh Hashanah. Okay? So Abai is asking of Yosef, would the same thing apply? I.e., would Rav say that these 3 houses would be unable to join together in an Eruv so that they could pass things through their windows into the chutzner? So, right, because remember, if you have a Jew and a non-Jew living together in a chutzner, you don't need to do any kind of schirus or anything. So Amar le in. So Rav Yosef says that the same thing would apply, that Rav would apply the same halacha in a chutzner, that these townhouses would be unable to make an Eruv and pass between them and put things in the chutzner. Fine. Di'ilo Amar Mai, and says Rav Yosef to Abai, and he says, and if Rav would not say the same thing in the chutzner, what would be the nafkamina? So Abai says, well, hava amina time of the Rav mishum diksaver in mavui nitar belechi v'kora atju batam achzeres psuchim nesocha. Well, I may have simply thought that if we would say that this halacha was only by a mavui, so I might think that the reason why this is not allowed has to do with the fact that this mavui is only going to be permitted if it has 2 houses, and each house is, and if it has 2 chutzers that open up into it, and each chutzner has 2 houses. And this isn't the case over here because we don't take the non-Jew and his chutzner into account when establishing hilchos Ayruvin, and therefore you really just have 1 chutzner that has this 1 house in it, and that's why you're unable to carry into the mavui. And I might think that is why Rav didn't allow this Eruv to take place between these townhouses and the chutzner, because the mavui simply just doesn't have the design to support that. However, I might think that in a chutzner it would be okay. Fine. V'tarte lamali. How come I need Rav to teach this twice, right? We had Rav say this at the beginning of our daf today, that in order to be able to carry in a mavui, you have to have 2 chutzers and 2 houses opening up into it. So then, why do I need Rav also to say this over here? That when you have these 2 chutzers, one is a non-Jew, one is a Jew, townhouses, whatever it is, you can't carry into the mavui. Of course you can't carry into the mavui. It doesn't have batim and chatzer. So why do we need Rav to teach us this twice? So tzricha, we need both of them. The imeahi hava amina diras over kochavim shma dira. Kamash malan to diras over kochavim lo shma dira. If we would only have the original case, which is that if you have 2 houses, if you have 2 chutzers opening up into a mavui, right? So then you can carry in it. So I might think that this chutzner, that non-Jews can be taken into account in terms of calculating chatzeros and houses. So therefore we have this case to say that no, we cannot take non-Jewish houses into account when calculating the houses of a chutzner and a mavui. Okay? V'imehacha, and if all we had was this case with the non-Jew and the Jew, but remember in this case there was only 1 house in each chutzner. So havamina lo yadaina batim kama. Over here I wouldn't know how many houses you need in each of the chutzers. So kamash malan batim train. So therefore Rab needed to teach us the original case as well, which is that you can only carry in a mavui if there are 2 chutzers that each have 2 houses in it. So there's a detail in each of the 2 cases. Over here, we're learning that you can't take the houses of the non-Jews into consideration when calculating the batim and the chutzers. And the other case teaches that you have to have at least 2 houses in each chutzner. Fine. Now, says the Gemara, Hashtadam Rav afilu chutzner. So now that Rav says that the same thing applies even to a chutzner, right? Because Rav Yosef had asked Abai, he said, if Rav would say that this thing with the townhouses and the non-Jew, they're only not allowed to make an Eruv and carry into the mavui, if we would say that that is only by a mavui but not by a chutzner, so we said, Rabbi said that I might think that I would have a havmina to say that therefore the reason why you'd be unable to carry into the mavui is simply because a mavui needs to have 2 chatzeros and 2 houses, and this wouldn't be the configuration. But that wouldn't necessarily, but to carry into a chutzner would be acceptable. So Rav Yosef says, no, even into a chutzner, it's not okay. Okay, fine. So hashda the Amar Rav afilu chutzner. So now that Rav says that with this townhouse, that if you have a Jew and a non-Jew living in one chutzner, and you have these townhouses connected to the house of the Jew, you still can't make an Eruv between the townhouses in order to carry into the chutzner. So time of the Rav, the Kosaver Asr Lasos Yachid B'makom Ove Kochavim. So how come you wouldn't be able to do this configuration in a chutzner? Because we do not want to support a Jew living together with a non-Jew in a chutzner, right? We had talked about this when it came to schirus, right? We said, like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, that 1 Jew and 1 non-Jew living together in a chutzner, they don't need to make a schirus because it's not common. But once already there's 2 Jews and a non-Jew living in a chutzner, the Jews would have to rent the space from the non-Jew in order to be able to make an Eruv. That's because we don't want to encourage Jews and non-Jews living together, and therefore they make, therefore they have to go out of their way and make like this rental agreement every single Shabbos so that it'll be easier to just move somewhere else. So therefore, we're going to apply the same thing over here. We don't want these 3 townhouses to be able to make an Eruv so that they can have picnics and potlucks in the chutzner, because since it's a Jew and a non-Jew living in that chutzner, we don't want to support, to make it easier to just kind of enjoy life in that chutzner. We'd rather support this Yid to move out. Alright, fine. So, Amar Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef says, if that's the case, Hanu Dishmaina le Rav Tavla. Rav Yosef says, okay, now I understand Rav Tavla. The Amar who said, Ovid Kuchavim Trezimne v'lo Yadayna my Amar. That Rav Tavla said, Ovid Kuchavim twice, and I didn't realize what he was saying, and I guess what he meant is that the Ovid Kochavim in these two different cases. One is when he's in his own Chatzar in a mavui, and one is when he's sharing a Chatzar with a non-Jew, with a Yid. Alright, Chaver, that was daf. Ayin Dalet. Yeah, it's a cool daf, right? Right. So, what do we talk about? So we talk about permitting a mavui with a lechi and a korah. Rav says that in order to permit a mavui with a lechi and a korah, you have to have two chatzeros that open up into, right, two chatzeros with, and each chatzer has two houses, and they open up, and the chatzers open up into the mavui. Shmuel had initially said that you only need one chatzer that has one house in it, plus another house. And Rabbi Yochanan says that all you need is one chatzer with one house, plus a ruin. Now, we ultimately then at the end, based on a question, Rabbi Lazar's question on Shmuel, said that Shmuel would also agree with Rav that you need two houses that are in two chatzers to open up into the mavui. And then we talked about moving things from a chatzar to a gag to a karpaf, right? From different rishus hayachid. According to Reb Shimon, it would be okay as long as these things started Shabbos in the chatzar. And Rav says that the halacha is like Reb Shimon as long as the chatzar did not do an Ayruvin chatzeros, so we can assume that anything in the chatzar was there when Shabbos began. However, Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan say that we pass on like Reb Shimon even if the chatzar did do an Ayruvin chatzeros, and we're not concerned that you're going to carry from your house into some other chatzar. And then we got into this interesting configuration where you have like a townhouse, and you have one of the townhouses that are in a chatzar, and then the other two townhouses open up into Rosh Hashanah. So we said that, and now there's a non-Jew in the mix. So whether the non-Jew is in his own chutzner in a mavui, or whether the non-Jew is sharing a chutzner with the Jew, they should not make an eruv in order to enable moving things from the chutzers into from the different houses through their windows into either the chutzner or the mavui. Rav says that would not be acceptable. Chevra, have an awesome day. Peace out.